Jake Martinez knew something was very wrong when the ship started shaking. He had been studying alien animals for 12 years, but he had never been in a crash before. The research ship Horizon was falling apart as it dropped through the thick air of planet Kepler 442c. Emergency systems failing, the computer voice said in a calm tone that did not match the chaos around him. Prepare for impact. Jake strapped himself into the escape pod as fast as he could. His hands were shaking as he checked the safety belt. The planet below was covered in thick green jungle, and the Galactic Council had marked it as very dangerous. They said deadly beasts live there, creatures that could kill anything. The escape pod shot out from the dying ship like a bullet. Jake watched through the small window as the Horizon exploded in a ball of orange fire above him. Pieces of metal and plastic rained down around his pod as it spun toward the jungle below. The trees rushed up to meet him. Jake closed his eyes and held on tight as branches crashed against the pod's hull. The sound was like thunder mixed with breaking glass. The pod bounced and rolled, tearing through leaves and vines until it finally stopped with a loud bang. Everything went quiet except for the hissing of broken systems and the drip of some unknown liquid. Jake's head hurt badly, and warm blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye. He tried to move but felt dizzy and sick. The world spun around him like a bad dream, and then everything went black. When Jake woke up, he was not in his escape pod anymore. He was lying on cold stone in what looked like a cave. Dim light came through cracks in the rock above him, showing rough walls and a dirt floor. His whole body ached, and his head still pounded with pain. Jake sat up slowly and looked around. The cave was much bigger than he first thought. It stretched back into darkness, and he could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. But where was his escape pod? How did he get here? He checked his body for injuries. His left arm had a deep scratch, and his ribs hurt when he breathed, but nothing seemed broken. His uniform was torn and dirty, covered with mud and strange green plant juice. When he reached for his gun, he found only an empty holster. Someone or something had taken his weapon. That's when Jake heard it. A low growling sound that seemed to come from deep in the cave. The sound made his skin crawl, and his heart beat faster. He was not alone in this place. Jake pressed his back against the cave wall and tried to make himself as small as possible. The growling came again, closer this time. In the dim light, he could see something moving in the shadows. Something big. Two golden eyes appeared in the darkness, glowing like hot coals. They were at least 8 feet off the ground, which meant whatever owned them was huge. Jake held his breath and did not move a muscle. Maybe if he stayed very still, the creature would not notice him. But the eyes were already looking right at him. They seemed to study him with an intelligence that surprised Jake. Most wild animals had empty, hungry looks in their eyes. These eyes looked curious, almost thoughtful. The creature stepped into the light, and Jake's mouth fell open. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, even in all his years studying alien life. The beast was the size of a small truck, with a long, powerful body covered in black scales that seemed to eat the light around them. Its head was huge, with a mouthful of crystal-clear teeth that looked sharper than any knife. But the most shocking thing was not how scary it looked. It was how carefully it moved. The creature placed each massive paw with precision, never making a sound on the stone floor. This was not some mindless monster. This was a hunter, and a smart one. Jake remembered his training files about this planet. The locals called these creatures shadowmaws, and they were supposed to be extinct. The last one had been killed 50 years ago, or so the reports said. But here one was very much alive, and it had somehow brought Jake to this cave. The shadowmaw sat down about 20 feet away from Jake, still watching him with those burning golden eyes. It tilted its massive head to one side, like a dog trying to understand a new sound. Jake realized he was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe normally. Minutes passed in silence. The creature just sat there, watching and waiting. Jake's mind raced with questions. Why hadn't it killed him? Why bring him to this cave? What did it want? As if it could read his thoughts, the shadow maw made a different sound. Not a growl this time, but something softer. Almost like it was trying to talk to him. Jake had no idea what it meant, but he had the strange feeling that his life had just changed forever. The beast that everyone thought was extinct was very real, and for some reason, it had decided to keep Jake alive. Now he just had to figure out why, and more importantly, how to stay that way. 3 days had passed since Jake woke up in the cave, and he was starting to understand the strange routine of his life as a prisoner. Every morning when the sun came up, the shadow maw would leave the cave. But before it went, it always moved. Huge rocks in front of the cave entrance. The stones were so big that Jake could not even budge them. No matter how hard he tried. Jake had tested this on the first day. He pushed and pulled at the rocks until his hands were bleeding and his muscles ached. The stones did not move even a little bit. He was trapped as surely as if he were in a jail cell made of iron bars. But the shadow maw always came back when the sun went down. Jake would hear the scraping sound of the rocks being moved, and then the massive creature would enter the cave carrying something in its mouth. Usually it was some kind of animal it had killed during the day. The beast would drop its prey near the back of the cave and then settle down to eat. At first, Jake thought he would die of hunger. He had no food, and he was too scared to ask the shadow maw for any. But on the second day, something strange happened. After the creature finished eating its kill, it used one of its huge claws to cut off a piece of meat. Then it pushed the meat across the cave floor toward Jake. Jake stared at the offering. The meat was from some kind of animal he did not recognize, but it looked fresh and it smelled good. His stomach was cramping with hunger, and he had not eaten in almost 2 days. Still, he was afraid. What if this was some kind of test? What if the creature was just playing with him before it decided to eat him too? But hunger won in the end. Jake picked up the meat and ate it raw. It tasted strange but not bad, and it made his stomach feel much better. The shadow maw watched him eat, and Jake could swear he saw something like satisfaction in those golden eyes. This became their routine. Every night, the shadow maw would share its food with Jake, and every day, Jake would explore the cave system while the creature was gone. He quickly learned that this was not just one cave, but many caves connected by tunnels and passages. Some were small and cramped, while others were huge chambers that disappeared into darkness. Jake found water in several places, clear streams that trickled down the walls and collected in small pools. The water tasted clean and cold, better than anything that came from the ship's recycling systems. He also found that the temperature in the caves never changed much. It was always cool, but not cold, comfortable even in his torn uniform. Third day, Jake made a discovery that changed how he saw his situation. He was exploring a tunnel he had not been in before when he found a chamber filled with bones. At first, he thought they were just the remains of animals the shadow maw had eaten over the years. But as he looked closer, he realized something was different about these bones. They were arranged in patterns, not scattered randomly like the leftovers from meals, but placed carefully in rows and circles and other shapes. Some of the arrangements looked almost like pictures, while others looked like the symbols he had seen in ancient human writing. Jake knelt down and studied the bone patterns more carefully. One group of bones seemed to show different animals. Another group was arranged in what looked like a map, with small bones marking different locations and larger bones showing what might be rivers or mountains. A third group was the most puzzling of all. It showed what looked like the outline of a creature that might have been a shadow maw, but next to it were symbols that Jake could not understand. As Jake examined the bones, he heard the familiar scraping sound that meant the shadow maw was returning. He quickly left the bone chamber and went back to his usual spot in the main cave. The creature entered carrying tonight's dinner, another animal that looked like a cross between a deer and a lizard. But this time, something was different. Instead of just dropping the prey and starting to eat, the shadow maw looked directly at Jake. Then it made a sound, a series of low rumbles and clicks that almost sounded like it was trying to say something. When Jake did not respond, the creature made the sounds again, louder this time. Jake realized that the shadow maw was trying to communicate with him. All those bone arrangements in the other chamber, they were not just random decorations. They were messages. The creature had been trying to talk to him all along, but Jake had been too scared and confused to understand. "I found your bones," Jake said out loud, feeling a little silly for talking to a giant predator. "The patterns in the other room. You made those, didn't you?" The shadow maw's eyes seemed to light up when Jake spoke. It made more sounds, excited rumbles that filled the cave with echoes. Then it did something that shocked Jake completely. The creature stood up and walked toward the tunnel that led to the bone chamber. It stopped and looked back at Jake, clearly waiting for him to follow. Jake hesitated for a moment. This could be a trap. Maybe the creature was tired of keeping him alive and wanted to finish him off in private. But something in the shadow maw's manner told him this was not about danger. This was about understanding. Jake followed the creature through the tunnel to the bone chamber. The shadow maw went to one of the bone arrangements and used its claw to point at different symbols. It made soft sounds as it did this, like a teacher trying to explain a lesson to a student. Jake watched carefully, trying to memorize the sounds and the symbols the creature was pointing to. Slowly, an amazing idea began to form in his mind. The shadow maw was not just intelligent. It had created its own language, using bones as letters and words. And now it was trying to teach that language to Jake. The creature was not his captor. It was trying to be his teacher. A teacher of what? And why had it saved him in the first place? Jake had a feeling that the answers to these questions would change everything he thought. He knew about this planet and the creature that lived on it. Jake spent the next week learning to read the bone language. It was harder than learning any human language he had studied before, but also more exciting. The shadow maw was a patient teacher. Every night when it returned to the cave, it would take Jake to the bone chamber and show him new patterns. Jake learned that different shapes meant different things. A circle of small bones meant safety. A line of bones with sharp ends pointing outward meant danger. 3 bones arranged in a triangle meant water, while 4 bones in a square meant shelter. Slowly, Jake began to understand the basic ideas that the creature was trying to share. But the real breakthrough came when Jake decided to try making his own messages. He found some small stones in the cave and arranged them in the same patterns he had seen the shadow maw use. When the creature saw what Jake had done, it made a sound unlike anything Jake had heard before. It was a deep, rumbling noise that seemed to come from the very center of the beast's chest. Jake thought it might be the shadow maw's way of laughing with joy. After that, the learning went much faster. The shadow maw would create new bone patterns during the day while Jake was exploring the caves. When Jake returned to the bone chamber each evening, he would find fresh messages waiting for him, and Jake would respond with his own stone arrangements, asking questions and trying to share his own thoughts. The first complete message Jake understood changed everything he thought about his situation. The shadow maw had arranged bones in a pattern that showed the cave, then bones pointing upward toward what could only be the surface, and finally bones arranged in the shape of terrible creatures with many teeth and tentacles. The message was clear. The surface world was controlled by monsters, and the cave was the only safe place. Jake arranged his stones to ask a question. What were these surface monsters? The Shadow Maw's answer was disturbing. It created a bone pattern that seemed to show creatures that were not quite real, things that existed partly in this world and partly somewhere else. The bones showed tentacles that could reach through solid rock, teeth that could bite through metal, and eyes that could see in all directions at once. The creature called them devourers in the bone language, using a pattern of bones arranged, like an open mouth with smaller bones disappearing inside it. Jake understood that these devourers were the real rulers of this planet, and that even something as powerful as a Shadow Maw was afraid of them. But Jake's biggest shock came when he learned the truth about the Shadow Maw itself. Using careful questions made from stone patterns, Jake discovered that the creature was not from this planet originally. The bone language told a story that made Jake's heart ache with sadness. The Shadow Maw's people had once lived on a different world, a place of great forests and crystal rivers. They had been peaceful creatures who used their intelligence to protect and care for their planet. But then others had come, beings that the Shadow Maw could only describe as the Takers in bone language. The Takers had captured the Shadow Maw's entire species and brought them to many different prison worlds. Some Shadow Maws had been taken to planets of ice and snow. Others had been sent to worlds of burning deserts. This one had been brought to the jungle planet, along with many others of its kind. But the Shadow Maws had not been alone on these prison worlds. Each planet already had its own terrible guardians, creatures like the Devourers that made sure no prisoner ever escaped. One by one, the Shadow Maws on this world had been hunted down and killed by the Devourers. Now only one remained, hiding in the deep caves and coming out only when absolutely necessary. Jake realized he was looking at the last member of an entire species. The Shadow Maw was not just intelligent and powerful. It was completely alone in the universe, the only one of its kind left alive on this world, and possibly anywhere. The knowledge made Jake see his own situation differently. He was not really a prisoner. He was a guest, maybe even a friend. The Shadow Maw had saved him from the crash and brought him to the only safe place on the planet. It was sharing its food and trying to teach him how to survive. In its own way, the creature was taking care of him. But why? Jake used his stones to ask this question, and the Shadow Maw's answer surprised him. The bone pattern it created showed a small figure that could only be Jake, standing next to a shape that looked like a spaceship. The message was clear. The Shadow Maw knew that Jake had come from the stars, and it believed that Jake's people might come looking for him. The creature was not just protecting Jake. It was hoping that Jake could be its way off this terrible planet. After so many years of being trapped and alone, the Shadow Maw saw Jake as its only chance for freedom. Jake felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. The creature was depending on him, but Jake's rescue beacon had been silent for over a week. Either the signals were not getting through the planet's thick atmosphere, or no one was coming to look for him. The research ship Horizon had been on a mission to study dangerous planets, and the Galactic Council might decide that this world was too risky for a rescue operation. That night, Jake made a decision that would change both their lives. Using his stones, he created a message for the Shadow Maw. We leave together, or we stay together. He did not know if rescue would ever come, but he knew he could not abandon the creature that had saved his life and shared its most precious possession. With him, its language, and its trust, the Shadow Maw studied Jake's message for a long time. Then it created its own response, a pattern of bones that Jake had never seen before, but somehow understood perfectly. It meant family or pack, or something even deeper than that. It meant that they belonged together now, no matter what happened. Jake Martinez had come to this planet as a scientist studying alien life, but he had found something much more important than any research project. He had found a friend who needed him, and whom he needed in return. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners. 2 weeks had passed since Jake's crash, and his rescue beacon was still silent. He had checked it every day, hoping to see the small green light that would mean help was on the way. But the light stayed red, which meant either the signal was not getting through the planet's thick atmosphere, or no rescue ships were coming. Jake knew he had to take action. Using the bone language, he explained his plan to the Shadow Mall. His escape pod had crashed somewhere in the jungle above them. Inside that pod was an emergency kit with signal boosters that could make his distress call much stronger. If they could reach the crash site and set up the boosters, Jake's signal might be able to punch through the atmospheric interference. The Shadow Mall's response to this plan was immediate and frightening. It created bone patterns that showed the surface world in more detail than ever before. The jungle was filled with devourers, creatures that hunted in packs and could sense any living thing that moved above ground. The path to Jake's crash site would take them directly through the most dangerous territory on the planet, but Jake had an argument that the Shadow Mall could not ignore. He arranged his stones to show 2 choices: stay in the cave forever and slowly die of despair, or take the risk and maybe find freedom among the stars. The Shadow Mall stared at Jake's message for a long time and created its own response. We try. They spent the next 3 days preparing for the journey. The Shadow Mall taught Jake how to move silently through the jungle, showing him which plants would hide his scent and which sounds would attract the devourers. Jake learned to read the signs that meant danger was near: the sudden silence of insects, the way certain flowers closed their petals, the strange shimmer in the air that meant a devourer was using its otherworldly abilities. Jake also shared his knowledge with the Shadow Mall. He drew pictures in the cave dirt to show how human technology worked, explaining the signal boosters and the rescue procedures his people would use. The creature absorbed every detail with an intelligence that amazed Jake. Sometimes he forgot he was talking to an alien predator and felt like he was briefing a fellow soldier. On the night before they planned to leave, the Shadow Mall led Jake deeper into the cave system than he had ever gone before. They traveled through narrow tunnels and across underground streams until they reached a vast chamber that took Jake's breath away. The walls were covered with bone arrangements from floor to ceiling. Thousands upon thousands of carefully placed bones told the complete history of the Shadow Mall's people. Jake saw the story of their peaceful world, their capture by the Takers, and their suffering on the prison planets. He saw maps of other worlds where Shadow Malls had been sent, and symbols that might have been the names of friends and family members who had died far from home. But the most important section was at the very center of the chamber. Here, the Shadow Mall had created a detailed record of its own life on this planet. The bones showed how it had watched its pack members die one by one to the devourers. They showed years of loneliness and hiding, of barely surviving in a world that wanted to kill everything that lived. And at the very end of this sad story, the bones showed Jake, a small human figure surrounded by symbols of hope and friendship. The Shadow Mall had added Jake to its history, making him part of the story of its people. Jake understood what this meant. If they did not survive the journey to the crash site, this chamber would be the only record that the Shadow Mall species had ever existed. The creature was trusting Jake with the memory of its entire civilization, just as Jake was trusting the Shadow Mall with his life. "I promise," Jake said out loud, even though he knew the Shadow Mall did not understand human words. "If I make it out of here, I'll tell everyone about your people. I'll make sure they're remembered." The Shadow Mall seemed to understand Jake's meaning, even without the bone language. It made a soft sound that Jake had learned meant contentment or peace. Then it led Jake back through the tunnels to the main cave, where they would spend their last night in safety? Neither of them slept much. Jake checked and rechecked his equipment. The torn remains of his uniform, a sharp piece of metal from his escape pod that could serve as a knife, and a small emergency light that still had some power left. It was not much to take on such a dangerous mission, but it would have to be enough. The shadow maw spent the night grooming itself, cleaning its scales and sharpening its claws on the cave walls. Jake had seen the creature do this before, but never with such care and attention. It was preparing for battle, getting ready to face the most dangerous predators on the planet. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the cave ceiling, the shadow maw moved the rocks away from the entrance for the last time. Jake looked back at the cave that had been his home for 2 weeks. It had been a prison, but it had also been a sanctuary. Most importantly, it was where he had learned that intelligence and friendship could exist in forms he had never imagined. The shadow maw made a questioning sound, asking if Jake was ready. Jake picked up his makeshift knife and turned on his emergency light. Outside the cave, the jungle was waking up with the sounds of birds and insects. Somewhere out there, the devourers were hunting. And somewhere beyond them was Jake's escape pod, with the equipment that might save them both. "Let's go find that signal booster," Jake said, and stepped out of the cave into the green twilight of the jungle canopy. The shadow maw followed beside him, moving with the deadly grace of a born hunter. They were no longer prisoner and captor, or even teacher and student. They were partners, and together they would either find freedom or die trying. The most dangerous part of their adventure was about to begin. The journey through the jungle was like walking through a nightmare. Jake had studied dangerous planets before, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Every shadow could hide a devourer, every sound could mean death, and every step forward took them deeper into territory, where even the shadow maw was afraid to go. They moved slowly and carefully, following paths that the shadow maw knew from years of careful observation. The creature had mapped every safe route through the jungle during its time as a prisoner on this world. It knew where the devourers liked to hunt, where they rested during the day, and how to avoid the areas where they gathered in large groups. Jake learned to read the jungle's warning signs. When the insects suddenly stopped making noise, it meant something dangerous was nearby. When certain flowers closed their petals in the middle of the day, it meant the air itself was poisoned by a devourer's presence. When the light seemed to bend and twist in strange ways, it meant one of the creatures was using its otherworldly powers to hunt. They had been traveling for 10 hours when they encountered their first devourer. Jake smelled it before he saw it, a horrible stench like rotting meat mixed with burned metal. The shadow maw immediately crouched low and signaled for Jake to hide behind a fallen tree. Devourer was unlike anything Jake had ever seen in all his years studying alien life. It was not really one creature, but many parts that moved together like they were controlled by the same mind. Writhing tentacles covered in sharp spines reached out in all directions, testing the air for prey. In the center of this mass of moving parts was something that might have been a mouth, filled with rows of crystal teeth that seemed to exist partly in this world and partly somewhere else. But the most frightening thing about the devourer was how it moved. One moment it was sliding along the ground like a giant snake, and the next moment it seemed to step sideways out of reality itself, peering 20 feet away without crossing the space in between. Jake understood why even the shadow maw was afraid of these creatures. They did not follow the normal rules of how things should work. The shadow maw waited until the devourer moved away and led Jake on a wide path around the area where it had been hunting. This happened 2 more times during their journey, and each time Jake was amazed by the shadow maw's knowledge of devourer behavior. The creature knew exactly how far they needed to stay away to avoid detection, and exactly when. It was safe to move again. After 18 hours of careful travel, they finally reached the crash site. Jake's escape pod was a twisted wreck of metal and plastic, half buried in the muddy ground where it had hit the jungle floor. But the emergency compartment was still intact, and Jake's hands shook with excitement as he opened it and found his signal booster equipment undamaged. Jake worked quickly to set up the signal booster while the Shadow Maw kept watch for devourers. The device was simple to use, designed so that even injured people could operate it in an emergency. Jake connected the power cells, extended the antenna array, and activated the emergency beacon that would send his location to any rescue ships. In the area, the signal went out immediately, much stronger than before. Jake's emergency transmitter began receiving responses within minutes. A rescue ship called the Endeavor was only 2 hours away, and it was coming fast. Jake felt a surge of hope and excitement. They had done it. Help was coming, but their success created a new problem. The stronger signal that would bring rescue was also attracting every devourer within 50 miles. Jake could hear them moving through the jungle, drawn to the electronic noise like moths to a flame. The creatures were converging on the crash. Sight from all directions. The Shadow Maw heard them too. It made warning sounds and used quick gestures to tell Jake that they needed to find a defensive position. The crash site was in a small clearing surrounded by thick jungle, which would normally be a disadvantage. But the Shadow Maw had a plan. The creature positioned itself at the center of the clearing and began making deliberate noise, roaring challenges that echoed through the jungle. Jake realized what the Shadow Maw was doing. It was drawing all the devourers toward itself, making itself the target so that the rescue ship would have a clear place to land. The first devourers reached the clearing just as Jake heard the sound of spacecraft engines overhead. The rescue ship Endeavor dropped through the jungle canopy like a falling star, its landing thrusters burning away the undergrowth. But even as the ship's loading ramp began to open, the devourers attacked. What happened next lasted only 3 minutes, but Jake would remember every second of it for the rest of his life. The Shadow Maw fought like nothing Jake had ever seen. It did not just attack the devourers. It controlled the entire battle, using its knowledge of their behavior to predict their moves and create opportunities for the rescue team to reach Jake safely. When a devourer tried to phase shift around the Shadow Maw's attacks, the creature was already moving to intercept it. When the monsters tried to surround the landing zone, the Shadow Maw herded them away with precise strikes that forced them to regroup. It was like watching a master chess player who could see 20 moves ahead. Jake ran toward the rescue ship as human soldiers poured out to provide covering fire. But their energy weapons were almost useless against creatures that could slip in and out of normal reality. Only the Shadow Maw's claws and teeth could hurt the devourers, and there were too many of them for even the greatest hunter to fight alone. As Jake reached the ship's loading ramp, he turned back to see the Shadow Maw surrounded by enemies. Creature was still fighting with incredible skill and courage, but Jake could see that it was getting tired. Blood was flowing from wounds on its sides and legs. The devourers were wearing it down through sheer numbers. The rescue team leader grabbed Jake's arm and tried to pull him into the ship. "We have to go now," the soldier shouted over the noise of the battle. "We can't stay here much longer." But Jake pulled free and looked back at the Shadow Maw. The creature was still fighting, still protecting them all, but Jake could see the end coming. In a few more minutes, the devourers would overwhelm even the greatest predator on the planet. As if it could read Jake's thoughts, the Shadow Maw looked up at the rescue ship. For just a moment, its golden eyes met Jake's through the ship's reinforced window. And in that look, Jake saw something that almost broke his heart. The creature was not afraid of dying. It was happy that its sacrifice would save Jake's life. The Shadow Maw had kept its promise. Jake was going to be free. Jake pressed his face against the window as the rescue ship lifted off, watching the final battle below. The Shadow Maw fought until the very end, taking as many devourers with it as possible. Even when the jungle swallowed both predator and prey in darkness, Jake could still hear the sounds of combat echoing through the trees. 2 hours later, Jake was safe aboard the Endeavour, giving his initial report to the rescue team commander. He told them about the crash, about the cave system, and about the creature that had saved his life. But he did not tell them everything. The full story would take much longer to share. In his private quarters that night, Jake began the real work. He started writing down every bone pattern he could remember from the Shadowmaw's language. He drew maps of the cave system and described the history he had seen written on the walls. Most importantly, he began to plan what he would do when he reached human space again. The Shadowmaw species was not extinct. Jake was sure of that now. The creature had shown him bone patterns that indicated other prison worlds, other places where Shadowmaws might still be alive. And if they were still alive, they were still suffering, still trapped by the same mysterious enemies who had destroyed their civilization. 6 months later, Jake's report changed everything humans knew about the galaxy. The Colonial Authority launched rescue missions to 17 different worlds based on the information the Shadowmaw had shared. They found survivors on 12 of those worlds, Shadowmaws who had been living in hiding for decades, waiting for someone to help them find their way home. The species Jake's new friend had called the Keepers was no longer alone in the universe. They had knowledge about the mysterious enemies who had destroyed their world, information that would prove crucial as humanity expanded into the deeper parts of the galaxy. The official records said that researcher Jake Martinez was the sole survivor of the Horizon disaster. But Jake knew the truth was more complex than that. 2 beings had entered that jungle clearing together, and in the most important ways, both of them had walked out alive. The Shadowmaw's sacrifice had saved not just one human, but an entire species. And that, Jake thought, was the most human thing of all. Sometimes the greatest victory was not about who survived, but about what they chose to die for. Jake kept his promise. The Shadowmaws were remembered, and they were free.